I deliberately chose the way that meant that I had to be nationally elected. So the electorate is 54,000 colleagues who have got the vote to vote. And I put myself forward for that. And that was a deliberate and intentional thing so that, alhamdulillah, I was successful. But it was so that when I walk into a room, people will know that I got there because the membership wanted me. It wasn't because of privilege. It wasn't because of me understanding the system or having people in high places. It was because my grassroots support is so important to me, but also that's what got me there.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And actually, it's a big episode today because we have a huge guest, Dr. Aaliya Goyal. Thank you so much, my sister, for being with us. Jazakallah khairan.
Barakallah feek. Walaikum salam.
Just so that the audience might be able to know you, like me also, I want to discover you. Can you present yourself to the audience, inshallah?
Inshallah. So my name is Dr. Aaliya Goyal. I am what we call a GP, but many people know us as family doctors or family medicine specialists. I have a special interest in occupational health, which is health at work, and I'm based in the West Midlands in the United Kingdom.
Just a little bit of context. In 1948, when the NHS was founded, general practice was seen as, I quote, the bedrock of the system. Now, and I think we know it, especially in France, because we are very known for strikes. We see a lot of strikes in the UK in this field. Many feel that the NHS is now very pressured and under-resourced, at least from an external perspective. I wanted to ask now a question that relates to your leadership. You are someone who has a lot of leadership in the field. What inspired you towards leadership roles across healthcare in the UK? And how do you want to see your work impacting the future, inshallah?
Inshallah. So I wouldn't say that I actively pursued leadership at all. My relationship with leadership started by seeing the potential value of an organization that I was part of, but feeling that what they offered wasn't really what I wanted or what I liked. And so I took a positive approach and started to contact the organization to say that I would like to organize, events and things on their behalf when the focus was on, this is before COVID. So the focus at that time was on education rather than on creating community, meeting peers and understanding each other. And so although they were receptive in principle, they wouldn't fund it. And my vision was around making inclusive spaces for people to come together. But looking back, it wasn't really about that event. It was really about a desire to create change, build relationships and bring people along with me. And so in doing so, I kind of learned a few skills along the way about how to deliver something that people would enjoy, come together with, and they're still talking about it. And really that's what leadership is. It's about engagement with the people that you are serving and creating opportunities for positive change and hopefully, leaving a place in an organization better than when you found it. And then since then, I've had several roles outside of that organization as well. And in terms of kind of my future in occupational health and general practice, it's really about focusing on the organizations to meet the needs of the people that they're serving, populations, and what those populations look like now. So you just touched upon the start of the NHS in 1948. And I think the way that the population was, the way the demographic was very, very different then. That demographic no longer exists and it's not reflected in the leadership. So I'd like to think that I'm in a small space of time. It's about influencing from the bottom up. And as long as you take the people with you, you can achieve anything.
Amazing. I'm so glad to have a sister, a hijabi sister in this podcast to talk about this topic. I think who better than a sister to talk about this? I was really trying to look for a sister in this season because, I think you are underrepresented. And also you said it, we need better representation, especially in the leadership positions. I think one of the things that is very interesting is that, for instance, I come from France, where there's a lot of Islamophobia. Muslims cannot certain times access leadership positions because of certain barriers, or even non-Muslims, but from a colored background and so on. But maybe it's not going to be the same challenges in the UK. Maybe they're going to be different. From your journey so far in the healthcare industry, what do you think have been the biggest challenges stepping into national leadership positions in the UK? And what advice maybe our sisters will be listening what lessons would you tell them they can learn from your experience?
So I'm going to be honest with you, it has been very challenging, and sometimes it's quite difficult to say how challenging that it's been. And there's so many lessons. I don't really know where to start, but loneliness is actually very real in leadership. So sometimes you get into these spaces and you work really hard to get into these spaces, but then you're surrounded by people who may not resonate with like what my lived experience is or my professional experience. And they don't really understand that their policies and their processes and all those barriers exist because it's never impacted them, because those policies were created, well, they weren't necessarily created with people from diverse backgrounds in mind. And a very hard lesson that I've learned is that organizations are largely protective of their own interests. And so they may not want to change in the way, but also the pace that you do. So then sometimes a challenge can be learning about yourself and asking yourself if your desire for change is worth the time and energy that you're giving, or if it's best to go to organizations where you're more able to influence and thrive. But one of the most important things that I have learned is that building a network of allies and people to support me can be protective to some extent, even if those allies are outside of the organization.
It is a brilliant answer. And actually, I had something I wanted to ask you out of curiosity. Like last year, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, I forgot what was happening. I was in France at the time. There was a huge surge of, for instance, Islamophobia happening with some people in the political sphere trying to emulate that effect. And there was a lot of Islamophobia. I invited so much people from the UK, mostly brothers. I always told them the UK in the Western Hemisphere is the place for Muslims. I live in Canada. I think it would be a close second, I think. But I just wanted to know if since last year, things have gotten worse. I come from France where, for instance, hijabi women cannot have a life. And I feel for them, it's unbearable for them to do any type of work, not even trying to aim for leadership positions. I think that would be impossible in France. You would never be able to see it. I just wanted to know in the UK if since the last year things have changed for the worse, unfortunately, or is it still a place where minorities are encouraged to, at least from a marketing perspective, because I know there's a difference between what we promote and what is the reality. Is there like such a thing where there has been a transition?
So I think that the events that you're referring to are related to a very tragic incident that happened last year.
Yeah.
And that sadly there are certain groups within any country, I would suspect, who are just looking for reasons to start violence and things. And it's got nothing to do with the original reason, the original tragic incident that caused it to happen. It's more a question of them wanting to use that for their own aim. In terms of the UK as a whole, I think that, I can understand what you're saying about other countries, and it is very different, but I still think that the barriers still exist, and we may touch upon that later. But certainly, leadership, and I say this lots of times, I do believe leadership should reflect the population. And so, if you've got a significant number of people from a diverse background or from a certain faith heritage, and I'll say faith because I identify as a Muslim, but Muslim is a global religion, right? So it's got nothing to do with heritage country.
Yeah.
When you've got a large population, then it should stand to reason that they will be reflected at all levels of society, including at leadership as well.
Very good. And talking about like the diversity, the UK is an extremely diverse country, all parts of the UK. Here, I just saw when researching for this podcast, and I think you would know way better than me, we realized that during COVID, there were the communities where we are from, but not only Muslim people, also like Black communities were particularly impacted by the effects of COVID. So South Asian and Black communities were, following a study that I saw on the internet, were particularly impacted by COVID. How do you think occupational health can play a role? Like one day we might have another thing like COVID. How can we try to change things so that our communities, whether South Asian or Black communities, are not suffering as much as they did before?
So that's a really big question. So my passion for occupational health is a part of my passion for tackling health inequalities. And so occupational health is about health at work. And it's a really, really important lever because work is a very important social determinant of health. And what you've just described, so we saw during the pandemic that there was a huge impact of COVID-19 on our communities. And one of the many reasons for that was because these marginalized communities were more likely to be in people-facing roles. Those minimal low paid roles where they were less likely to have paid time off if they needed to isolate, which made them more vulnerable. And certainly in the UK, in the National Health Service, the first healthcare professionals who died from COVID were from diverse communities because they were more likely to have got COVID from work, didn't have the appropriate masks, and weren't able to alter their work pattern to keep them safe. And you also touched upon the pressures within the NHS. And in my opinion, that with those ongoing pressures, access to health advice through work is going to become increasingly important. In my work in occupational health, there's an element of being proactive and doing health promotion. So we do, one of the roles I'm in at the moment, we do health screening for diabetes, for obesity, and all those kind of things. And we give independent advice to the employees in work. And so because the whole aim is to allow people to stay well and safe in work. And in the areas where I work, a significant number of our population and people in work are from the diverse communities who may not access social media or GPs or hospitals unless they are in a serious poor state of health. So occupational health is a way to reach them before they get to that state, but also aligning with the fact that people need to stay in work, because if people can't earn, certainly in the UK, we have an issue with the cost of living. Everything is so much more expensive now, and that can impact every other aspect of people's lives, how they eat, how they exercise, and all those other things. And so I do believe occupational health is really, really important. I think the main challenge is access to it, but I think there are new measures being taken to address that as well.
This is amazing. I wanted to ask something that, in France, we have, I'm not based in France anymore, but I don't know Canada as much as France. We have public healthcare. And for instance, we get paid by our employer, even on the part where the government doesn't pay us for health. So basically, healthcare is entirely free almost for any Frenchman. But the main obstacle in France is medical deserts, like we call them in French. I'm trying to do a literal translation, where my best friend, for instance, he's a doctor. He's Turkish. He's a doctor. And like they propose to those young doctors to go in those medical deserts, even at a higher pay, because nobody wants to go there. And usually where nobody wants to go, it's in our communities. Is there such a problem in the UK in some marginalized communities?
So my experience is really around general practice, so family medicine in those areas, and certainly where I live, it's an area of high socioeconomic deprivation, which is largely inhabited by people from diverse communities, and that's where all the health inequalities are. And what we often find is that, as you say, these places are kind of unattractive, shall we say? And there are pockets of places like this all over the country. They're kind of unattractive for doctors to work, not because those doctors don't care, but just because they're very challenging communities. There's high risks of burnout, and it's very difficult to maintain, kind of doctors often come with really great intention, and then they end up leaving because it's just too hard. And what we find is, certainly from the general practice family medicine perspective, is we talk sometimes about ratios. So the number of GPs per patient. So in some of the most deprived areas, there are higher patient to doctor ratios than there are in the green, leafy, affluent areas where the populations are easier. So there is also this kind of alignment where the populations that are most in need of good healthcare may struggle with attracting doctors to work in those areas. But of course, there's so many factors involved, and there have been initiatives to address that with incentivizing through pay. But all these are very long-term things that need to be solved. General practice at the moment is unattractive, full stop. Lots of people are struggling as it is. And so it stands to reason that when people are struggling, the areas that are the hardest to work in are going to struggle the most.
That's a brilliant take. That's a brilliant insight, sister. And I cannot help but think that, for instance, I used to work for a company where actually my two previous companies, they had a doctor on site. It's a bit of type of a Hunger Game word that I feel it's a paradox, where I tell myself that some people are lacking doctors, and for people in corporate, they even bring doctors on site so that you don't have time to waste.
Yes.
Would you rather not have a doctor in those areas where people need it? It's terrible. I think it's quite unfair. It's practical for me, but it's maybe a life type of thing for some people. Sister, talking about representation, you're very active on social media. This is how I got to know you, actually, because you post so much insightful articles. You are nominated for so many things. Actually, you make our community proud, so thank you so much. Thank you on behalf of our sisters in the UK and abroad. Thank you for your representation. I think representation is key also, because certain times when you are a visible minority, you have even more weight on your shoulders. I mean, certain times, but it's almost always the case. You represent a huge community, and as Muslims, we have to be even more aware of what we say, because we know that we're going to be judged by external people from our community, but also our own community, because we're underrepresented and people feel that we are representing them. Anyway, I just wanted to know what motivates you to all the time trying to, I know it's very hard sometimes to be the only person in the room where you're the only hijabi. What keeps you going and what keeps you motivated to make a change, you, Aaliya?
So I think understanding what my core values are and what my core purpose is, I think that's what motivates me. So what you've just talked about is really around kind of role modeling and all those kind of things. And while that's a really important part of the story, I think that as Muslims, we're also driven by other purpose. So we're driven by a desire to help our communities. We're driven by, reward, not just in the dunya really, but also in the akhirah. We're driven by sadaqah jariyah. We're driven by so many things. And ultimately, when you enter leadership, I think that you have to be, my opinion is that you have to be very clear about your reason for being there. So some people, they get taken away with, they think it's very shiny and very, they like attention. Whereas, if you're very clear on what your purpose is, then you will also know on what you're not willing to do as well. And that can be challenging in order to be able to navigate those roles and those organizations, because sometimes they may feel that you will do the things, but sometimes it can be seen negatively that she won't do this or she won't do that. And we have other people and, higher things that we answer to as well.
Very interesting. And I actually wanted to provide an anecdote. In 2001, only 1% of NHS Trust Board members had a Muslim background. Today, we see a bit of change, but mostly in non-executive roles. That is the hard part. What do you think are the barriers still holding back our community to access those key positions where we can make meaningful change?
So I think often we focus on what I would consider to be external barriers, which are out of our control. And I think in the first instance, we need to start focusing and directing our energy towards our internal barriers, which we can control. So you've talked about increased visibility of Muslims in leadership, and that's an important first step, because for organizations, if you're not visible, then you are invisible. And for our communities, if they don't see someone doing something, then they may not feel that they can do those things either. So I think that in terms of the barriers, we need to start by believing that we can. Those who are in leadership can role model, as we say, but also what I also do is I commit to mentoring and supporting other leaders, emerging leaders in the first instance, just really so that I can just pass the baton on to them as I step down from roles and make space. Because one of the other problems in leadership is that people who have been there for some time are unwilling to step down and make space for new diverse talent, which isn't necessarily the case outside of healthcare. In terms of the other barriers, when people try to get in, they start to see all these barriers in policies and processes. And so the people who are already there, even if they've overcome those things, they should actually use those positions to try and change those policies so that the people that come after them don't necessarily have to struggle. Sometimes it's a very kind of, we call it like an old school way of thinking, where people say, well, I struggled, so therefore, they should struggle too. But, if we genuinely want to do good, then we should also be happy to kind of give leadership away to some extent. And although for me, leadership has come at a personal cost, I do think that it will become easier if we all commit to each successive generation, making it easier for the other people behind us. And now one thing I have noticed in healthcare leadership is that we are a lot more organized than we used to be. So you mentioned non-executive directors a moment ago. So there are groups of people who are specifically looking to kind of coach and help people get non-executive director roles in order to kind of redress the balance a little bit more, because we make the rules. We are sowing the seeds for tomorrow, and we've got the power to change our future as well in whatever way we want to.
There are some Muslim organizations that, for instance, in the corporate sector, we have Muslim networks, at least in Canada and the UK, where, for instance, people work in corporate, but they can try to lobby, let's say, to have, for instance, a prayer room, have prayer breaks for Jummah and so on. And they organize, for instance, gigantic iftars. I think you are very familiar with those type of organizations. So I just wanted to know, in the healthcare industry, I have no knowledge. Actually, I have no knowledge of this. I think you are pretty organized between Muslims in the UK in this sphere, but can you tell us more about, for instance, if I'm somebody which is Muslim in the UK, where can I find an organization to try to help me out in the beginning and afterwards in terms of leadership?
So in terms of general organisations in healthcare, so the British Islamic Medical Association is one of the largest ones, probably, and they are very good in the fact that they are organised in lots of different ways. So one way could be around the profession that you're in, one way could be around the region that you're in. They hold annual conferences and they support the younger generation in terms of getting jobs, but also the challenges that you've just mentioned, and things around prayer rooms, maybe halal food, maybe iftar, provision of things during Ramadan and all those kind of things. So they can help with that. Also, because of the fact that I'm, you've seen me on social media and networking, sometimes when people come to this country as international medical graduates, they may not be aware of those kind of larger organizations. And so they affiliate more with their country of origin. And so I've recently spoken at the Sudanese British Primary Care Association. So mashallah, they're all Muslims. It's such a warm environment, and they're all supporting themselves because we have this intersectionality. So not all Muslims are the same in the sense that they come from different backgrounds, different cultural heritages. And so there's a lot that kind of connects us, but sometimes they want specific understanding because, as you've already mentioned, the healthcare system in so many different countries, it's mind-blowing, isn't it? How it is in France, how it is in Canada, how it is in the UK, let alone how it is in Sudan or Nigeria or Pakistan or wherever people have come from. So there's lots of organizations, but the most important thing is that people need to remember that they are not alone and there is an organization that's there for them. It's just a question of finding the right person to help.
That is brilliant. I think when we discussed earlier, you said I'm really passionate about mentoring, especially for our sisters. You have essential skills, public speaking skills. You are very eloquent. You have leadership as strength that we need in our community. I think you have so much skills. So can you tell us about your passion for mentoring our sisters? What was the need you identified? And what impact you're trying to have?
So I think with our sisters, again, I think it comes down to an understandable fear in some ways. So mashallah, like as with our brothers, our women, our sisters, they have so many skills and they are so committed to kind of, as we said, leadership was about making change. So they're so committed to wanting to change and wanting to make things better, but they don't know how to do it in a way that is not only going to kind of make an impact, but also more importantly, I think staying true to who they are. So sometimes people can get lost a little bit in leadership. They can be so focused on, doing well or going up in an organization that they forget their purpose, which is what I was talking about before, but also trying to stay authentic to their values or the reasons why they got into it in the first place. I think that sometimes when I walk into a room where, as you mentioned before, I may be the only kind of brown person or the only person who's wearing a hijab. And so it's interesting that sometimes I can actually see a visible reaction on people's faces if they don't know me. But then as soon as I open my mouth, they realize that actually I was still born and raised in the UK. I was still educated here. If I was on the end of a phone to you, as opposed to physically in front of you, you may not realize how I look. And so I think sometimes one of the most interesting things is that rather than me internalizing what people are thinking of me, it's causing them to reflect on the biases that they had. Because as soon as I walk into that room and open my mouth, they know what I'm talking about. And with one of my roles, one of the national ones, it's on a council of the Royal College of General Practitioners. It's due to finish shortly. There's lots of ways of getting onto that council. I deliberately chose the way that meant that I had to be nationally elected. So the electorate is 54,000 colleagues who have got the vote to vote. And I put myself forward for that. And that was a deliberate and intentional thing so that, alhamdulillah, I was successful. But it was so that when I walk into a room, people will know that I got there because the membership wanted me. It wasn't because of privilege. It wasn't because of me understanding the system or having people in high places. It was because my grassroots support is so important to me, but also that's what got me there. And I think that also it's a showcase of the power of our voices. And so when I talk to women, going back to your question, about wanting to get into leadership, I remind them that actually we do have a strength. because we are strength in numbers, we are strength in expertise, but also, inshallah, even if people have a hard time, maybe like I have had, it'll make it easier for everyone else.
Inshallah. I remember discussing with actually a brother who came in the podcast, and he was saying to me that the situation because I was applauding how diversity was considered in the UK in comparison with France. Of course, there is a margin for progression, let's face it. But I was applauding it, and he was saying, but when my parents came, it was not at all like this. It was even worse. And
Yes.
we can see, inshallah, the impact, the legacy you're trying to aim for. Inshallah, you will have it, sister. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about this. And because you made me think of something, it's that also we want a leadership driven by advocacy also. We don't want someone to just see diversity instead of seeing it as something that I can leverage for my community, that when I will be represented there, I can help my community. They instead, certain people, it's a minority maybe, but they just see it as an opportunity because it's promoted everywhere. I can get this role, and when I will get there, then I will be happy there. And they're just like a kind of puppet. We want more driven type of leaders like you, who are willing to make a difference for, you mentioned grassroots, who never forget where they come from, what community they are from, and they're willing to make a change. I feel that also, this is my last thing on this, I feel that also certain countries are also looking for those apathic leaders that are going to represent us in terms of diversity, but are not going to make any wave. So what are your thoughts on this? Tell me.
So I can only speak for the UK situation. So certainly in the UK, and I'm not going to name names, but we have seen in the UK political arena, especially, that there are people whose heritage is from other countries, whose parents even came over as refugees, and those people have actively, I wouldn't say, that I think there's a difference between not wanting to help our communities and making it harder for our communities. And so those people whose parents have benefited, if they don't wish to help our communities, that's fine, but they've actively made life harder, which is not good. And so we see that in politics, and we see that in other spheres. And I think what you're talking about is almost like having a diversity tick box. So it's having someone there who looks visibly as though they are, creating this illusion of an inclusive leadership, but actually the reality is that they're not doing that. In terms of my own advocacy, I just want to make it clear that not everything that I do is necessarily visible to the public. So there are things that I've done which are internal within the organizations that I'm part of, which I don't need to shout about, because at the end of the day, Allah knows what I've done. But it's really about knowing that it's the small steps, but together, if we have lots of people making those small steps, together we will be making the bigger steps. And ultimately, everyone has to answer for themselves, because we know that people will get whatever it is that they intended.
This is brilliant. Actually, this is a perfect transition. That you're known for connecting people across sectors, our sisters all over the UK. What advice would you give? I'm really focused on the sisters here, to everybody listening, because I suffer from underrepresentation. Even in my podcast, I don't have enough sisters. So I'm really focused on the sisters here. What skills do you think we need to pass along? But what type of efforts are you trying to make?
So I think that, so again, we've talked about the changing demographic and the increasing in numbers of the Muslim community. And so obviously this doesn't just fall on my shoulders, it falls on everyone's shoulders. So we have organizations like the British Islamic Medical Association, which I've talked about already, and they support not just doctors actually, but people at university all the way throughout their career. And so what I would suggest is that people become part of those groups, because there will be a place for you within those. As I've said, one of the things that I do is about bringing together people from different specialities as well. So, but also I'm a huge fan of the voluntary and community sector. So within our communities, I do find that we have little groups that voluntarily do good in their community, but they're not necessarily part of a wider organization. So for example, we'll have the groups of women who get together, who will support each other through through pregnancy or childbirth, or we will have like an old person's home which specifically meets the needs of our elders. And obviously we have families who tend to take care of those things, but sometimes they may need a place to go to in the daytime, just so that they can build their own sense of community. And so what I like to do is I like to find out about those kind of organizations. conversations and connect those with the organizations that I work with, not just for funding, but also to increase the visibility of everybody's work. Because at the end of the day, our risk is written for us, and me sharing contacts and me sharing all these opportunities, it's not going to diminish what happens for me. It's not going to diminish what happens for them. And it's all about being part of something that's bigger to us. The habits that are kind of critical to success about, so you've touched upon social media, and everyone talks to me about social media, but with social media, it's knowing what it is that you want people to know about you, what your message is, and who your audience is. So for some people, their audience is, for example, members of the public. So they will give messaging advice to the members of the public. For me personally, my audience isn't necessarily the public. It's more for professionals, people in leadership, people who can create change. And so once I'm clear about who my audience is, what my message is, what it is that I want to do. So do I want to update them? Do I want to give my perspective? Do I want to tell them what I'm doing? A lot of the time I talk about what I'm doing so that people can see all the different groups that I'm mixing with, and then people will come to me to try and get into those groups as well, which is absolutely fine. But, we need to just be confident. Be confident in ourselves, because I'm sure that people have got really important things that could also change things for the better as well.
This is perfect. And actually, you talking about confidence brings me to my next question, is that you have talked about the past, and for instance, I refer to the study of 2001. What did you notice of the perception of Muslim women at the time? If you saw them, or if you are the only one like in leadership in the healthcare industry, do you see that right now they are more ambitious, they are less discouraged by the obstacles that they are facing? Do you see an evolution of the perception that we are making change, or do you think that we are stagnating, decreasing? What is your perception of our progression?
I think that we are progressing. Certainly, I remember when a time when you didn't see any visible Muslim leadership at all. And now it is definitely increasing, certainly in my region, in healthcare. It's across all facets, not just in clinical work, but also in, for example, the digital sphere and all of those things. And I think that once people, as I said before, once there will be sisters who've got lots to offer and lots to give. And once they see those individuals, then they can feel that they can do it too. So I do think it's a positive evolution. I do think it's also reflected by the increasing population as well, because these are the numbers that are in the population, so that will translate upwards. But generally speaking, I would like to get to a point where the visibility of what we look like is less important than what we bring. This is about what I offer, and how I look and how I choose to present myself shouldn't be a factor in how listened I am, or the knowledge that I bring, or the understanding that I want organizations to have to make things better for our communities. And so for me personally, although I present as that, which is what I am, I don't go into organizations thinking I look different, because I'd like to think that I'm quite good at building connection and building rapport with people. And I have found that for me personally, support has come from the most unexpected of places, but that's because also I haven't projected that I am different in my conversation, because the things that unite us are far greater than the things that could potentially see as being different.
I just wanted to know, we talked a lot about you representing. I want to zoom in on you so that people get to know you a bit more. What skills, habits, or even strategies do you do on a daily basis for you to be competitive in those leadership positions? You are very eloquent also, like you're super eloquent. You're one of the most eloquent people I've had on the podcast. What skills and habits do you have to stay as you are?
So it's interesting, isn't it? So I think the way you've said that question is actually very good. So there is a difference between habits and skills. And sometimes people think, people talk about this thing called imposter syndrome, you may have heard. And people think they haven't got the skills, but sometimes you don't actually need the skills. You just need the right habits. Right. So, for example, the things for me that have been critical to success are about simply understanding that if you have sabr, if you are patient, if you are consistent, if you show up, if you are reliable. When people ask me to do something, I know it's taken a little while to pin down a date for today for this discussion, but when I say I'm going to do something, I will do it. And that consistency and reliability, even without necessarily having a skill set, will get noticed. So it's about understanding that and playing the long game. I'm sure you've heard of the concept of delayed gratification, which is,
No.
so the concept of delayed gratification means that you may not necessarily achieve what you want immediately, but know that it will be coming and it will be better. So sometimes when I gave a talk recently about the importance of doing voluntary work in our communities, and I made a comment, and it was a room full of sisters and brothers, and they were all very lovely, mashallah. And I made a comment that sometimes, you know, when I ask a brother to do something, he will say, "How much am I getting paid?" And then they all groaned in the room, whereas the women will just do it. And this is what I'm talking about. So sometimes if people do stuff, it might not be the reward. For example, money might not be in that moment. However, by doing that thing, they are learning the skills. They are storing up something for the future. So the reward will come later, whether that's financial, through a job. So certainly my voluntary experience, I used to do a lot of work with, one of my passions is around the refugee and migrant community. And so the work that I did on a voluntary unpaid basis for that, because it led to a role where I was paid. Well, I do believe that was a factor. And so delayed gratification means that you won't necessarily get the reward, monetary, whatever it is, in that moment, but it will be coming. And that's a really important skill to understand. And in terms of the other skills and habits, it's networking, it's staying authentic, it's people knowing that you won't waver in the core things that really, really matter to you. So as I say, it was a huge, huge privilege to be elected to the council of a major royal college. And one of the privileges of that was actually knowing that the membership trusted me, that for any given thing, they knew that if there was a conversation that impacted our diverse communities, if there was a conversation about health inequalities, if there was a conversation about social justice, they knew that I would speak for them. So building trust is a really important strategy, regardless of whatever it is that you do.
I noticed that now, especially people like you who are not reluctant to change, they understood that we have to put ourselves out there. We have to go into those new technologies, like we have to be on social media. We have to build something on LinkedIn. We have to be present, and it will contribute to our impact that we're making. And I just want to know, how did you seize this opportunity to try to make an impact? How are you leveraging social media and all those new things, like any type of social media, trying to make an impact and help you deliver the message you're trying to deliver? How are you using those type of things? Also, last part, what piece of advice would you give to our younger brothers and sisters so that they also feel that it's important to be out there?
So with regards to social media, so although I haven't really been using LinkedIn for that long, I have been active on social media. So just to be clear, these things don't happen overnight. They happen, over time. So sometimes people will post something and it won't necessarily get the engagement they want, and then they'll feel disheartened. But with social media, it's not just about writing about yourself, like this is what I did and this is where I've gone and what I've done. It's also about looking outwards. And sometimes people forget that social media is about building reach and expanding reach. And so it also involves commenting on other people's work, sharing their good work, finding people who you can align with, connecting with them, potentially taking those conversations out of that social media. And I have actually developed real life friendships as a result of social media. And I've also got jobs and roles as a result of social media. But it's also, again, it comes back to knowing what my purpose is. I know that for some people it can be a bit scary, particularly in the healthcare profession. So in the healthcare profession in the UK, we have the General Medical Council, which is a GMC, which is essentially a body that is responsible for us. And they have very strict guidance on social media. And so sometimes people worry about putting themselves out there and basically falling foul of that. So if you identify as a doctor, you do need to follow the right guidance. But generally speaking, you can find your own balance. The thing about social media is you put out what you want. So that if there are things that you don't want to put out, you don't have to. Some people will feel uncomfortable sharing personal details, which is absolutely fine. Some people will recognize that it's a like for me personally, it's a professional platform. So I will interact in a way that I hope is professional and that is aligned to work as opposed to other factors. And, I kind of stay out of business that isn't mine. And I hope that people will stay out of my business that isn't theirs either. But it's a huge opportunity, and it helps to make sure that you are finding the people that you want and being able to kind of hear from them in a way that otherwise is not limiting. And sometimes you can find people in Toronto even, who you never thought you would meet. And why is that? It's because of the power of social media.
Actually, because we talked about things evolving, I also wanted to know, because like me, I'm mostly on the corporate side. I wanted to know, in your leadership position, are there like trends or things onwards in the future, some innovations that you think will change the healthcare industry or how you practice?
So I mean, I think we're in a constant state of evolution in general, and some of those changes are driven by necessity. I'll be honest with you. So, for example, it's really interesting. A lot of the reason for change not happening is because of bureaucracy or those processes. But when we were faced with, as everyone else was, when we were faced with the COVID pandemic and people were dying, things happened very, very quickly. So, for example, in my world, which is family medicine and general practice, we started to do more remote consultations and use more of digital and tech and AI. But that was born out of necessity. There's a lot of increase in flexible working now. People can actually have a huge presence even without leaving their homes. And certainly there are doctors I know who are fully remote workers as well. And so I like those kind of things in the sense that it makes things more inclusive. There are lots of people who were excluded from making an impact. I do a lot around equality, diversity, and inclusion, and I'm thinking about people with disability and long-term health conditions, which also impacts our communities and is an additional layer. There's always technology. I do believe that you still need humans involved. AI is only as good as what you feed into it. The algorithms need to reflect the diversity of the population. Otherwise, it's not fit for purpose. We know that even simple things have changed. We have organizations in the UK who are showcasing the difference of medical devices. So, for example, during COVID, when you had those probes on your finger, which showed you how your oxygen levels, the people who had, melanin in their skin, so brown, black communities, the readings were wrong. And so that whole action was wrong. People are recognizing that technology can be utilized to level the playing field, but also to work in a way that makes people feel included. My worry is around, what people consider to be efficiency. So I was at a talk the other day where it was talking about the use of AI in medical consultations. And they were saying that by using this amazing AI, we can reduce the time frame for each consultation. So therefore, we can see more people, within the working day. And although that's really good from a corporate perspective, I do worry about the human side, about burnout and about and all those kind of things, particularly because we are living in a really difficult environment now, the cost of living, the cost of food, all those kind of things. And so it has to be balanced with the human impact rather than technology for technology's sake.
Exactly. And Sister Aaliya, there was an essential thing that you made me think of. For instance, in Germany and France, there is the number one app. It's called Doctolib. It allows you to book an appointment with your GP. And one day, I was in Paris, and Paris is a very cosmopolitan city. It's like London, There are so much doctors from Algeria, from Morocco, and so on. And there are, of course, names which are more Caucasian and so on. And I remarked at the time that, for instance, and this is an essential question I wanted to ask, is actually like the confidence gap. Like certain times, and when I was scrolling around, I saw that all, for instance, the Caucasian booking appointments were booked. And like, for instance, Algerians, Moroccan names that I could recognize because it's my community, I could see they had so much slots available. And I told myself that we are in that shortlist type of, where we shortlist, we're trying to see, okay, who's the best doctor and so on. Certain doctors are facing like a bias where, for instance, people in Paris will tell you, I'm not racist, I have so many friends, you would never suspect. But then when they're making a decision for their health, for their life, they are not choosing someone from our community. I just wanted to know, it's a bit off topic, but I wanted to know, what are your thoughts on this confidence gap that is here?
We've talked throughout this conversation about the importance of diversity in leadership, and somewhere along the line, in whatever process we're talking about, there will be leaders who are making those decisions that will advantage or disadvantage populations. And this is the whole point. Talking to somebody the other day about decision making for when, a doctor is faced with a disciplinary procedure. And essentially they were talking about the people who make those decisions. And I was like, well, actually, we are strong in number. We have got leadership potential. So we should aim to get into those leadership positions ourselves. So there's two aspects here. One is about the individual. Patients can self-select who they wish to see. And, that's a societal issue, right? And then there's stuff that's within our own gift. Okay. And for that is where a leadership gap would be. The division of these programs, the implementation of these programs, the recognition. So we have a thing called equality impact assessments here. I don't know if you have it in other countries. And we also have things like the HEAT tool, which is basically when we look at something, it's, what are we trying to do from that and what are the unintended consequences? And so it's really around the governance of these things. But again, we can change those things if we get into those positions. So my approach in leadership generally has been to get into those positions, to create the pipeline of leaders moving forward, to leave a legacy behind me, moving, thinking backwards, but also empowering our communities to be those change makers. And if individual patients choose not to consult with those individuals, we can't do anything about that, but we can make the process fairer so that we can actually have that level playing field. And I don't know how the remuneration works in France, but if, obviously if people are becoming severely disadvantaged, so in the UK, if a doctor is booked for a morning session, they're going to get paid regardless of whether that session is filled or not, right? It's not dependent on how many full slots or empty slots, they're going to get paid. And so, you could argue and say, well, it doesn't really matter because they're getting paid and they're happy. So really it's about understanding what is a problem that you're trying to solve and then getting into the positions where you can solve those problems. Because I think a lot of our community, and again, it comes back to the belief in ourselves, we can struggle with a victim mentality. Right. And so when I walk into a room, yes, I am the only brown person. Yes, I am the only person who wears a scarf. But the second I open my mouth, I hope they can see the value I bring.
Yeah.
And if I walk into there thinking I'm disadvantaged, I will be the quiet little mouse in the corner. And anyone who knows me knows that I am not the quiet little mouse in the corner. That comes from me, knowing that I deserve to be there.
Champion. And you talked about legacy, and this would be my last question because our sister is so busy. What do you want to leave as a legacy? Let's say in 10 years, what impact would you have tried to leave behind?
I think that I've demonstrated that it is possible to do a lot in a relatively short space of time. A lot of what I've done has been in the last 5 years only. And, and that's because of my drive and my vision and values, right? I'm not going to say, I've not been positive. I don't believe I have been positively advantaged at all by how I look. If anything, it's the opposite. But the point is that you can overcome if you have the strength of character, but also the belief in what it is that you want to do. And I hope that people will see me and consider me to be brave and encourage themselves to be brave as well. And because you can be visibly representative of faith and still succeed. So overcome your internal barriers, make sure whatever you do, you bring people with you, you mentor others, you lift others, you elevate others. On my social media, you may notice that I'm constantly bigging up other females in leadership because also you're seen as part of something wider. So excellence in contribution and excellence in meaningful change happens with all of us collectively. And we should also champion others because this is not about me. This is about what we can achieve together for the benefit of everyone.
It was really a pleasure to listen to you and to learn from you. I learned so much for this podcast. Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Aaliya. Thank you so much for your time. We're really grateful.
Okay, Barakallah Fiik, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Allah Hafiz.